Great.
Perfect.
No,
All right.
I'm not gonna turn it off. I'm
Yeah.
only going to do this.
You'll still be here. And if my microphone turns off, you'll have to like remind me. All right, so we'll get started with this thing then. Okay, so yeah, thank you for joining me. My name is David Dirk Smith, and today we'll be doing our workshop on unpacking motivational climate as a complex system. I'm very excited about this topic as it will be the first time I am presenting on this for an actual audience. So let's get started. All right, so first thing we're going to do is talk about the agenda. So what is, first we're going to cover a real world example of a complex system in sport. We're going to briefly review what motivational climate is, and then we're going to talk more about complex adaptive systems. We're going to talk about motivational climate as a complex adaptive system. Then we're going to cover the meteorology metaphor and then take some considerations for applied practitioners, and then a final takeaway. And what you can see in this picture here, just real quick, is what's called a berberation. It's a flock of birds that are flying around. It's a really great, simple example of what a complex system is. So as you go through this presentation, I want you to think about, maybe your sports team or a group of athletes or whatever it is that you're doing. Think about that as a complex system. So in a flock of birds, there's no central leader. Okay. It's all the birds fly in formation together, but the birds are only governed by a simple set of very basic rules. The basic rules are to maintain, certain distance between the birds on the right and the birds on the left, as well as to follow the general direction of the bird in front of you. And as all birds kind of go by this rule, it is considered a complex system because then you can see all sorts of different shapes and movement patterns and things as this entire flock kind of moves as a one big unit into different shapes and patterns, as well as it's sensitive to things like wind and rain and different conditions within the environment. All right, so going to a real world example of a complex system in sport. My favorite is the 2014 World Cup, with particularly the semifinal match between Brazil and Germany. So a little bit of context here is that Brazil and Germany were the top two ranked teams of the World Cup, and they went up together against each other in the semifinal. Prior to the semifinals, Brazil was doing really good. They won all of their games except for one. The only one that they did not win was the one that they tied. But they were doing really well. During those 5 matches, they only allowed 4 goals to be conceded. So out of 5 matches, they only had 4 goals scored on them. And then came the semifinal match between Brazil and Germany. And let's just say it was not as impressive as the previous 5 matches before, because Germany scored 5 goals within the first 30 minutes of the match. And 4 of those goals were scored within 15 minutes of each other. So it was like, what happened? Germany won the match 7-1. And it was such a shocker because, well, you're talking about the 2 strongest teams at the World Cup here. Brazil already being able to handle its own quite well. All of a sudden, Germany's winning 7-1, which is a margin that does not really happen or, is seen at the World Cup. So what happened, Brazil? It was a huge drop of performance as a team, and it shocked everybody. Nobody understood what happened. Why did Brazil have such a sudden drop in performance? Well, Brazil suffered a total team collapse, and there wasn't really a specific cause. Well, there was a straw that broke the camel's back, but it wasn't the only reason why it collapsed. The ultimate overall reasons come down to a complex web of elements on the individual, team, and contextual level, as well as their interactions with each other that tipped a stable system into a chaotic state. And that straw that broke the camel's back, ultimately came down to what happened between the quarterfinal and the semifinal. So the contributing factors were, in this case, the loss of 2 leading players, Neymar and the captain, Silva. They had a lack of preparation and resiliency within the team structure to adapt to the loss of these players. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back, was the lack of these players. and the team just had no preparation or resiliency within the team structure to adapt to these to the loss of these players, because those were their two strongest players, and without them, the team lost focus and they lost guidance, and they really didn't know what to do or how to adapt to that. At the same time, it was a very high pressure match for both Brazil and Germany. A lot more so for Brazil, because it was the home team, playing the World Cup in their home country, and they were the two top ranked teams in the whole World Cup overall. So whoever won this match would probably be the team that wins the World Cup. Even though this was only a semifinal, they would go on to the final, win the World Cup, and that happened because Germany won, and then they went on to win the World Cup. But well, when Germany started scoring those goals and they hit those 5 goals within the first 30 minutes, that's when the team collapse occurred, because the collective efficacy and the team confidence dropped like dramatically. All of a sudden, Team Brazil realized, oh crap, we can't do this. We're not going to be able to catch up, and everything just fell apart at that point. So going from that as an example to a brief review on motivational climate. Motivational climate is defined as the environmental status of sport that influences motivational levels. It is inherently complex and unique to the individual's culture and context in which it exists. So like I said, it's similar to what we just talked about with some of the issues that Team Brazil faced, right? It wasn't just one thing. It's a complex system that involves elements from individuals, team, culture, and specifically the context in which it exists. And the same applies with motivational climate. Motivational climate is not theory. What's the word? Not dependent on one specific theory. It utilizes both self-determination theory and achievement goals theory in conjunction with one another to help fulfill and broaden the overall approach to motivational climate. Okay, so I know that there's a lot of theorists out there and a lot of sports psychologists and other people out there who subscribe to one theory or the other, and their theory is right, the other one they don't give a crap about, right? There's a lot of strengths in both theories, and there's a lot of weaknesses in both theories, and there's really no supporting evidence either way that shows one is better than the other. So that's why they both kind of are standing the test of time right now in terms of the accepted approaches to motivational science. Well, there doesn't have to be just one theory. These theories can work together. They can work in conjunction with each other. They can really support each other. And the great thing with motivational climate and complex systems is that it doesn't just support that, but it depends on it, because there are multiple ways of seeing things, and there's a lot of different aspects that we want to try and understand. So being able to try and pinpoint it down to like a reductionist type cause doesn't really support what we're trying to do in terms of motivational climate or complex systems. Traditional research methods rely solely on cross-sectional questionnaires and correlational methods that only provide a limited snapshot. And that's the reason why I have this picture specifically on this slide, because Steffi, do you know what this movie is in the picture?
No.
Okay, well, can you just looking at the picture, what do you see? Can you just describe what you observe?
I see a woman, and it has like a long fingers.
Okay. And you if you had to judge, what is the plot of this movie based on this picture?
Oh, I will say that maybe some hallucination.
Okay. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's how motivational science currently exists, with research methods based on questionnaires. It tells you nothing, right? So it's like looking at a screenshot from a movie and saying, okay, what's the plot of the movie, right? Unfortunately doesn't give us a real good understanding. So we cannot solely rely on these questionnaires or correlational methods, since it doesn't give us a whole lot of information in the end. All right, so let's shift focus to complex adaptive systems then. The system is a makeup of, like I said, individual elements, their interactions with each other, and the environment, which is exactly what motivational climate is, which is exactly what happened with the causes of Team Brazil collapsing, right? In a complex system, behavior is considered as emergent, which means that there is no central leadership that dictates what the behavior is. So, like I said, with the flock of birds, right? There's no central bird. There's no like bird shouting, commands from like a little blowhorn, telling what the birds what way to go. It's emergent, right? So it's based on the individual elements of the system, how they interact with each other, and then the environment in which they exist. In this case, with a system, the output is greater than the sum of its input. I know with reductionist science, mechanical thinking, things like that, the output is the sum of the input, right? But in a complex system, it's greater because in a mechanical system, you just have, you put in one part, you put in the other part, you put in the other part, and then it works as expected based on the design of the parts, right? And so, but with this in this case, the way that the system interacts with each other, the elements that are there, the how they contribute to the system, and then the environment in which they exist, well, it's not so cut and dry. It's there's a lot more that goes on that we can't fully observe or understand until we see it in action. So that's why we say the output is greater than the sum of its input. And with that said, elements cannot be added or removed without changing the dynamics of the system itself. So, with Team Brazil, right? As soon as those players were taken out, the dynamics of the team were completely different, because now you took out two players, so the team is not going to play the same. It's not going to behave the same. It's going to have different action behaviors, right? And in any system, no matter how big or small the element is, if it's added or removed, it's going to change the ultimate behavior of the system. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, it's a good thing. It could be a bad thing. In the case of Team Brazil, it was a bad thing, but that's just the nature of how the complex system works. The complex system is sensitive to initial conditions, and this is known better as the butterfly effect. Basically, what that means is that the complex system is not only made up of the individual elements and their interactions, but is unique to the environment in which it exists. So the environment of which it exists also can help change the dynamics of the system based on the initial conditions in which it exists in, right? So, if you have a sports team, say the World Cup, you have the team playing in the World Cup. If the conditions were rainy or sunny, or hot or cold, or maybe you played in a stadium in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo, right? The changing conditions affect how the system itself behaves as well. And in the case of the butterfly effect, the metaphor for the butterfly effect is that if a butterfly in one part of the world flaps its wings, it could dictate whether or not there's rain or sun on another part of the world, because even the simple tiny actions of a butterfly flapping its wings can create a compounding effect of change within the development of the system that grows and grows and grows overall, that could influence the behavior of the system in the long run. So in a complex adaptive system, it also embraces outliers and changes within the system. And it is that behavior is not solely deterministic, nor is it completely random. So when I say it embraces outliers and changes within a system, reductionist science likes to just ignore outliers and pretend like they don't exist, because the outliers, mess up the average. The outliers mess up the kind of basic structure of the system, right? So they just ignore them. Well, in a real world complex system, you can't just ignore them. They exist, right? Neymar is an outlier. Neymar is way better than almost any other soccer player out there. Statistically speaking, he is an outlier, right? Well, if you have a soccer team, in the case of Team Brazil learned, well, you kind of want to have an outlier, because an outlier like Neymar helps you win. Versus, if you don't have them, then you're average, right? So in a complex system, outliers are embraced because they do influence the system. And like I said, the system behavior is not deterministic, but it's not completely random either, right? Because it's sensitive to those initial conditions, and the dynamics of the system itself are based on the elements that make it up, their interactions with each other, and the environment. In this case, short-term outcomes are predictable, but in the long term is inherently unpredictable. And this is why the basis of complex systems comes down to like the foundation of it is from predicting the weather, because that's where it got started at. Because you realized, okay, predicting the weather will always be an imperfect science, because no matter how much of the weather you can measure and understand, you can't, the longer you try to predict it out, the less accurate you're going to be. In this case, it's easier to predict in the short term. Like I know today it's probably going to rain or be sunny or windy or something like that based on the information that I can collect, but it may not be accurate for what's going to happen tomorrow because the system will change. Different things will happen. Again, butterfly effect can change the development of the system as it goes on. So, it makes it a little harder to be fully predictable. So with that, here's some terms. We have a steady state is a system in which the behavior is stable. The behavior is recognizable if not predictable. In a system, there is always attractors. Attractors are configurations of a system that attract certain action behaviors in which this behavior of the system is centered around. I like to use this picture of FC Magdeburg with the arrows because it's a good example of an attractor. In this case, FC Magdeburg played 5 games. It was a stable system. The team was a stable system who played 5 games without scoring a single goal, to the extent where the fans of the team made a bunch of arrows and positioned themselves on one end of the stadium and pointed the arrows at the goal to remind FC Magdeburg, where do you shoot the ball? This is your attractor. This goal is where your tractor is. Shoot the ball here. So in this case, in the case of FC Magdeburg, this is called a fixed attractor, which is one single point of, it's one attractor that just says, okay, your job, your behavior is centered around this attractor. And for FC Magdeburg, it was score a goal. This is the goal. Put the ball into this goal. That was a fixed attractor. There's also cyclical attractors where there's 2 attractors, right? So for example, you can have a competition goal, right? So in the competition goal, you want to score a goal. Well, in training, you're not scoring goals in training because it doesn't matter in terms of actual, the point of training is not to score a goal. The point of training is to train how to be competitive so that you can achieve your competitive goal, right? So in training, maybe your goal in that is, develop certain skill sets or, practice defense or, whatever that specific purpose of that training is. That's an attractor for training versus your attractor for competition, which could be, scoring goals or winning or whatever, right? That's a cyclical attractor because that means that your behavior of your system alternates between 2 different attractors. So you say, okay, in training, you're focusing on this. In competition, you're focusing on this. And again, because it's a system unique to the environment in which it exists, if you're in training, okay, you're doing this. But if you're in competition, you're doing this. So you go back and forth. And on that front, there's also something called a repeller, in which is the opposite of attractor. It's just configurations or behaviors that the system avoids, right? So for something like an attractor, you can have like your goals, goal setting is an attractor, action behaviors are attractors, different, almost anything that dictates what the behavior is an attractor. In the case of a repeller, it's also like avoidance behaviors, right? So, introjected motivation is a repeller because introjected motivation is avoiding guilt, right? Or avoiding punishment. So, you're not going to do things that are going to, you're going to take action to avoid the punishment. It doesn't matter what the action is as long as it avoids the punishment, right? Or you're, like if you're playing in a competition, you're going to avoid breaking the rules. You're going to avoid getting disqualified. You're going to avoid doing a red card. So those are what's considered a repeller because it's an avoidance behavior. And there's a phase transition in which there's a rapid shift in the system's behavior. And this can take place between like a fixed attractor and a cyclical attractor. So if you just say, okay, you go from like one goal and you decide, okay, well, we need to have something else to focus on here. And then all of a sudden you're changing, the behavior of the team by saying, okay, we're going to focus on this, but also focus on that. That's a phase transition. But then you can also have a phase transition from a steady state where the system is stable into a chaotic state. And what a chaotic state is, it's when the system starts to exhibit seemingly random and unpredictable behavior. And this happens when there's too many attractors present or there's no attractors present. And in the case with Team Brazil, when they lost Neymar and Silva, the team had no attractors because their leadership and guidance, they had, they were too centralized on these 2 players, right? And so those attractors were those players that helped guide and lead the team to what they were playing. So when they were gone, there was no attractors present. And without attractors, the team hit a chaotic state and they didn't know what to do. So there was like unpredictable behavior. It was random. It was like, lots of instability within the system. They were like fighting with each other. They were trying to figure out what to do, things like that. So that's what can happen. So in the case of Team Brazil, from the quarterfinal to the semifinal, they underwent a phase transition into a chaotic state. And this also happened during the semifinal because maybe at the beginning they were, relatively stable, but then as soon as Germany started scoring some goals, boom, it collapsed. Phase transition, steady state, chaotic state. In the case of Team Brazil, their steady state was basically like on stilts and pretty rickety, so it did not stay stable for very long. So, with that said, Team Brazil is what we would say what we would call on the edge of chaos. So the edge of chaos is a transition zone in which a bounded instability creates a dynamic interplay between order and disorder. Okay. And so those first 30 minutes of the match with Team Brazil, you could say they were on the edge of chaos because it's not completely stable and it's not completely chaotic either, right? But there's different variations of the behavior where it can become super unstable, but then it holds back to a stable state, just bounces kind of around, right? It's a high arousal state in which the system itself is more sensitive to initial conditions. So the butterfly effect is like heightened here because little tiny little things are just enough to tip it over into a chaotic state. In this case, with Team Brazil, right? So they were sitting there at the edge of chaos. Well, that was again, shown with like infighting and arguments among the athletes and stressful behaviors from the coaches. And then when Team Germany, like they scored a goal all of a sudden within the first few minutes of the game, that was a butterfly effect, right? Because that butterfly effect, boom, hit up and caused more instability in the system, and ultimately it tipped over the edge of chaos and did a phase transition into a chaotic state. With that said, an edge of chaos is also considered the optimal state for development, growth, adaptation, and change. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing if you're on the edge of chaos, but it also is you don't want to be too unstable, but you don't want to be too stable either, right? So it's kind of finding a balance because when you're at the edge of chaos and you're in this phase transition zone, you are at a higher arousal, you're more willing to adapt to changes within the systems, you're more able to recognize changes within the systems, you're able to find certain action behaviors that helped you to be more resilient and to grow and to do all these things, right? So some of the most successful teams and athletes exist on an edge of chaos kind of state, right? They're not too stable, but they're not chaotic either, right? They're kind of right there within this transition zone because they know, okay, well, I need to be at a higher arousal state. I need to be able to adapt to changes within my environment. I need to be sensitive to the initial conditions so I know how to go and what to do. But at the same time, you don't want to be too comfortable because if you're unable to adapt, then just like FC Magdeburg, you end up not scoring any goals at all, and end up losing anyway. So in this case, like one of my favorite quotes, don't be careless, but don't be too careful either. And when a lot of times, especially in either a chaotic state or at the edge of chaos, you see emergent behaviors, which are patterns of behaviors that exhibited by the system as a result of the interactions between the elements that would not otherwise exist among the elements itself, right? So sometimes you see like groups of players, like 2 or 3 players that work super well together. And, once those players start working together, it's like, magic. And it's like, okay, things are happening here, Well, those players as individuals might be mediocre at best, right? But all of a sudden they play together and it's like, boom, it just takes off and they're completely, different, right? So that's an example of an emergent behavior. And then my favorite here is what we call fractals or self-similar behaviors, in which patterns of behavior that occur regardless of scale or level. And a good example of this is goal setting, right? In goal setting, you have local level goals, you have midterm goals and you have long-term goals, right? So you have short-term, midterm, long-term goals. Well, those are different levels, right? So you have, what's my goal for today? What's my goal for tomorrow? What's my goal for this week? Is this a training goal? Is this a competition goal? Is this a get out of bed and just show up goal? Whatever these goals are, right? These happen every day, and they happen a bajillion times a day. These, could happen every minute, for example, or, every exercise, every training. These happen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times throughout the day, right? But those local level goals are determined and focused based on the midterm goals, which are kind of guided by what the long-term goals are, right? And so then the local goals are centered towards achieving the midterm goals, which is centered towards achieving the long-term goals. That's the example of a self-similar behavior, right? Because you have the same kind of goals that lead up to different scales, and they're vice versa too. So the long-term goals dictate the midterm goals, which dictate the short-term goals, and they influence each other. And when I say for something like goal setting, like I said, the long-term, like short-term goals are predictable, right? So I can wake up today and say, okay, my goal for today is I'm going to go and train, and I'm going to do, this. I'm going to do this level of performance in training today. This is my goal for today, right? I can predict this with more accuracy than if I were to say, okay, in 6 months from now, I'm going to achieve this specific training or this specific performance, because, in 6 months from now, there could be another global pandemic, or, maybe I get sick or something like that. And I can still predict it with some level of reason, but at the same time, I also can't be too stable in that goal, because things can happen that I can't necessarily predict, right? And the same with long-term goals. So if I were to say, okay, in the next 10 years I want to accomplish this and this and this and this, well, it's important not to be super specific, because who knows what can happen within this 10 years, or this long-term period, right? So the more general the long-term goal goes, you want to be a little more generalized and a lot less like specific, because you can't fully predict what's going to happen during that time. So it's better to be able to keep it enough where you can be able to adapt and be able to change. As like I said, you still want to exist on the edge of chaos, right? So you want to be able to be sensitive to the conditions, and be able to be resilient to changes within the system. And this is like the importance of self similarity as well. Another good example of self similarity is just when you observe behaviors, right? So when you see behaviors on like the individual level. So if you're observing a team, like a team of soccer players, you can observe the individual behaviors in the soccer players within, say, a practice, right? And you say, okay, this player exhibits these kind of behaviors, and this player exhibits these kind of behaviors, and here's this mindset of this, athlete, and this mindset of this athlete, right? So you can observe this, but then you start to say, okay, then you could see in groups of athletes, okay, do multiple athletes share this mindset? Are they connected to each other? Are they friends? Are they enemies? What are they? What's their relationship with each other? What is their behaviors they're exhibiting? Okay, do you observe these behaviors within the team structure itself? Right? Is it the team that exhibits these behaviors? Okay, well, if it's maybe the team, then are you observing these behaviors in the coach and the organization structure? Right? So maybe it's just the team, because of the coach, or maybe it's because of the organization itself. So do you observe this in multiple teams? Do you observe this in the league, the behavior of the league, right? And so on and so on. So again, different levels. So you have individuals, teams, organizations, leagues, competitions, everything. So you can observe different behaviors at this level and say, okay, what are some similarities that I see, and are they consistent? So maybe this attitude is because of a specific athlete, or maybe it's because of a greater, deeper attitude within the system itself, right? So this could be coming from a coach, from a team manager, from the sports psychologist, from the president of the club, who knows, but it's important so you can recognize when you see these self-similar behaviors. So helps you to better understand the context in which it exists, and if possible, maybe where the source of this behavior is coming from. So then we look at motivational climate as a complex system. And I like my little picture here of the butterflies, because, the butterfly effect. And this is where it gets really important, because as a sports psychologist, sports psychology professional, you want to be able to understand how is a motivational climate generated, okay? So that's what you have to ask yourself. And you want to find the answers to these kind of questions, right? How is an individual's perceived motivational climate generated? So what you observe, what action behaviors you observe, what do you learn from with these athletes, right? And then again, self-similar behaviors. How is a group's shared perception of motivational climate generated, right? Is it generated because of the attitude of the athletes? Is that from the coach? Is it, it's a little bit of everything, right? But what are the sources of this motivational climate being generated, and how is it being generated, right? Is it, could be a lot of, it could be anything, right? And then what are the elements that are interacting with each other, right? So like I said, if it's different people in multiple roles, you can have different athletes, playing different positions within the team, right? Or you can have, people like the coaches, sports psychologists, athletes, team managers, anybody like that. What are the different behaviors, rules, backgrounds, and contexts, right? So, what kind of behaviors do you see? Are they being, are they practicing good sportsmanship? Are they being more, immature? Are they acting like jerks, or are they acting very, supportive of each other? What are the rules, right? So the sport, of course, has rules. Every sport has rules. So what are the rules of the sport? Is this legal? Is this illegal? Will this get you disqualified? Stuff like that. Then you have, like, of course, the backgrounds, right? So not every athlete has the same background. You have sports teams made up of athletes from different cultures and different countries, or socioeconomic backgrounds, different social identities, all these different things. So where are these backgrounds? What are they? And then of course context, right? So a sports team in the rich neighborhood is going to be different than a sports team in a lower income neighborhood, or a school sports team versus like a club, or something like that, right? So the different contexts in which these exist. Um, and then the bigger question you want to ask is, do these things learn, remember, and adapt to what happened before, right? So for example, did Brazil learn, remember, and adapt to what happened at the 2014 World Cup? They, at the next World Cup, they definitely performed a lot better than they did last one, so clearly something changed there because they were able to learn to adapt to that. And that's just resilience, that's building resilience to say, okay, now you understand what happened before, so now you need to make changes and growth within your own system to, make sure that you're not you know put in that kind of situation again, and you're more able to adapt to that kind of a situation again. So then we can look at it from a meteorology point of view, because with motivational climate, I mean, it's a meteorology metaphor is basically what it is. So in motivational climate, you have your overarching motivational atmosphere, right? And within this atmosphere, this represents, everything from whatever your system is, right? So whether it's your entire team, your entire club, your organization, it could be a classroom, it could be a school, it could be, a workplace, it could be anything. And that represents your motivational atmosphere, right? So just when you enter this atmosphere, how do you feel? What is the kind of support you're feeling? Do you feel motivated? Do you feel miserable? What do you feel, right? And then of course you can come down to the contextual climates, right? So the contextual climates are the aggregate of the many instances in which momentary and situational motivational conditions exist. So you have training is a contextual climate, competition, the locker room, team meetings, team huddles, anything like that. That's all contextual climates, because those are instances where you have these different levels of momentary and situational behaviors and motivational conditions, right? And those conditions would be things like, are you feeling social support? Are you autonomous in this situation? Do you have competence? What is your goals? Things like that. That what helps form the conditions, and that's defined by those local action behaviors that come together, right? So it's not just one behavior, it's it's how they combine with each other, right? So if you're dealing with an athlete who has an attitude, maybe isn't being the most polite or respective or something like that, that contributes to the condition of that particular contextual climate. Okay. And again, it's like local level to global level to local level. So you see those self-similar kind of behaviors. And the great thing is that with local level motivational conditions, you can objectively observe them. So you can just sit there and watch what happens and be able to, gain a lot of information from that specific context without saying anything, without asking anybody anything. You just sit there and observe. So you can study how social factors influence athlete motivation, right? So, the different ways that the athletes interact with each other. And if it's better if you know more information about the athletes, right? So, if you know the background of the specific athlete, maybe you can better understand why he's behaving a certain way. And that's how social factors influence athlete motivation, and then you could combine that with subjective perceptual snapshots that can offer insight into climate and atmosphere development, right? So for me, when I was working with the soccer team and I work with the swim team and I work with the cheerleaders and stuff like that, I just any time I have an opportunity, and any athlete that kind of comes within my scope of vision or whatever, I say, hey, how are you feeling? How's it going? What are your thoughts? Things like that. I'm just trying to get a little snapshot at that moment of maybe how they're feeling. And of course, like I said, you can't use the snapshot to define a movie. You can't use it to make a generalized perception. But if I'm taking a lot of these snapshots from different people, that's giving me more information that I could take from, that gives me a better idea, based also on what I'm observing objectively and stuff like that I can use to kind of shape my assessment and better understand what's happening in this specific climate, right? So like I said, a proper assessment requires a more detailed understanding of the atmosphere, climate, and conditions, along with the nuances, interactions, and interdependence, right? So, for example, with the swim team, I know my athletes. I know how certain athletes respond to certain cues and certain behaviors. I know which athletes have like certain kind of goals that are more competitive versus goals that are more, just based on personal development, things like that, And so I know these things. So I know more about this. So when I go in and I ask them, okay, how are you feeling? And I can get this, it makes it a lot easier for me to be able to understand what's going on there. And then when I see them interacting with each other and pushing themselves and pushing each other, things like that, I have a better context of what's going on that makes it a little easier for me to be able to judge and assess what this overall climate and what this overall atmosphere is. That was kind of a lot. How are you feeling? Okay, we're almost done. It's like 2 more slides. Okay, so with all that said, the considerations for applied practitioners. Like I said in the previous slide, to give myself a more well-rounded assessment, we need to shift our thinking from low to high resolution behavioral assessments. So we don't need to have one assessment that asks a bunch of questions. We can have a bunch of very small assessment that asks the same question multiple times, So shifting from assessing generalized perceptions towards momentary interactions or shifting from assessed generalized perceptions towards momentary interactions, English. And saying, okay, these local level interactions, these momentary interactions can define, again, butterfly effect, can define how the system develops and changes. So the more I know how about these momentary interactions, the more I observe them, the better I can understand, okay, how are things developing in this contextual climate, right? Are the athletes expressing, what kind of behaviors are they expressing? Are they expressing anger? Are they expressing joy? Are they expressing, support? Are they expressing frustration? Things like that. And then again, being able to say, hey, how are you feeling? Oh, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling like I'm doing good today. Or, oh, I'm feeling pissed off or blah, blah, blah. Just that gives me everything I need to know. That's the only question I need to ask, because I could say, okay, this athlete's angry. This athlete's frustrated. This athlete's feeling good. Okay, blah, blah, blah. See how they're interacting with each other. And then from there, you could say, okay, well, all the negative athletes, they're starting to have a compounding effect on the other athletes, and it's bringing the change in the overall atmosphere, to a different state. So, it's all these things that can, add up. So just taking, these little snapshots at a high resolution offers a lot more information, and it gives me a greater insight, but it also helps to reduce the likelihood of erroneous conclusions due to a low sampling frequency. So I'm not going to ask one person all these questions when I can ask every single person one question. And then this way I can know from every single person, how do they feel? And this gives me a better idea than saying, oh, this one person feels good, so I'm going to assume that everybody feels good, when that is probably not the case, we can also shift from group level analysis to considering patterns and trends for the individuals within the group, right? So again, going from, making these overall group-based perceptions to actually learning and understanding all what's the what are the individuals in the group, what are they thinking, what are they feeling. This helps to facilitate fast and efficient and cost efficient learning while providing direct benefits for the individual, providing the insight, right? So for that, us as sports like for us as sports psychologists, if I ask an athlete, hey, how are you feeling? They say, oh, I'm frustrated. Okay, that's my opportunity to make an intervention. Okay, well, why are you feeling frustrated? Oh, because this player is acting like this, blah blah blah, what that, right? Okay, let's fix this problem right now, and then try to turn it around so that maybe the next time that they have this interaction, it's more positive or it's different. So this way, it makes it a little easier for us to solve these problems and nip issues in the bud right then and there, as opposed to waiting until they compound to become greater, issues that we can handle. It also offers personal insights into how they're reacting and what works versus what doesn't work for them, right? So, say you have a coach that has a specific way of motivating athletes. Well, you can understand how do these athletes respond to this coach's behaviors. Some athletes will respond positively to these coaches' behaviors and say, okay, this motivates me, but other athletes don't, right? A good example of this is so Michael Phelps, coach Bob Bowman. He worked with both Michael Phelps and Allison Schmidt, two Olympians. Of course, Michael Phelps is the more famous one, but Allison Schmidt as well. And he, in his book, he makes a specific example where he says, okay, with Allison Schmidt, he has to, you know, the way that he motivates her is completely different than how he motivates Michael Phelps, right? So they could be in the same practice, even sharing the same lane to each other, and he could get into Michael Phelps's face and scream at him and be a complete jerk, and that motivates Michael Phelps. That gets him going, and he goes. But if he did that to Allison Schmidt, she would like shut down and leave practice, because that's not going to work for her. That she's not going to respond on that level. So, it's being able to understand, okay, how do these athletes respond from these different kinds of behaviors so that we can better understand, and if again need be, make an intervention, right, and say, okay, try something different, you know and whether this is from coaches or from other athletes, from ourselves as sports psychology professionals, because sometimes we have to do this as well and have trial and error where we make a mistake and athletes don't always respond positively to the way that we try to work with them. So we need to be conscious of that as well. Um, it also, let's see, it discourages us from assuming a pattern observed at the group level applies similarly to all the individuals in it. So, like I said, just because the coach is saying this to the entire team and there's maybe a positive response from the team as a whole, doesn't mean that necessarily all the athletes individually are responding positively to that type of behavior. It also shifts from a static set and forget approach towards adaptive approaches in which we have to continuously tune and refine our interventions, right? So you can't just say, okay, here's a piece of paper that says follow these actions and you'll be better. You can't just say, okay, do this and then you're better, right? So we need to be constantly adapting. Again, we need to be on the edge of chaos in this regard, because if our athlete goes from a stable state to a chaotic state, they could have a complete collapse of their confidence, of their self-esteem, of their mental health, anything like that. And if that happens, then we've lost that athlete. They're not going to be able to play. They're going to be, and we failed as practitioners, right? So we don't want our athletes to go into a chaotic state, but we also don't want them to stay stable either, because if they're too stable, then they're not going to grow. They're not going to develop as athletes, and we're not going to be as effective in working with them, right? So we need to make sure that we are in an edge of chaos so that we could be constantly adapting and tuning and refining our approaches to make sure that we can stay on top of the changes within the system and help build the resiliency in that system as well. So this allows for the provision of the right type and intensity of support to the individuals at the right time. So maybe the way that we go about the intensity in day one might be different than day two, right? Because the conditions could change. It also helps us answer complex questions, such as what type of support works, in what circumstances, and for whom. And this better helps us learn about our athletes and our people as professionals so that we can, next time we have to make this kind of intervention, we are better prepared and we are more resilient, so we can be more effective in the future. So, the final takeaway. Um, The biggest takeaway is understanding that we are only influencing and steering the motivation. We are not determining the motivation. This makes it easier for us to navigate the complexity of the social interactions and motivational climates. Okay. I use this picture of the dinosaur chasing after the car. And if you look, the car has a baby dinosaur in it. This is from the movie, the sequel to Jurassic Park, The Lost World, right? And in that sequel, there's a specific scene where the T-Rex gets released into a city, and he goes rampaging around the city, and the T-Rex is lost and confused and scared and angry and hungry and thirsty and all these things, right? And so he's just rampaging around causing chaos. It's a chaotic state. Well, the people in the car realize, okay, we know how to get this T-Rex back to where we want it to be in the cage. And so they go and basically steal the T-Rex's baby. And they say, hey, T-Rex, I got your baby. T-Rex is like, oh no, my baby. And then T-Rex starts chasing after the baby, and they drive to pull the T-Rex back to the cage. That's an example of exactly what we're doing, right? The T-Rex is motivation. We cannot control that. I cannot control the T-Rex. But I can definitely tell you, if I had to, I would get in a car with that T-Rex's baby and drive it around to try and get the T-Rex to get out of, other people's way, right? And so, like I said, we are navigating the complexity. We are influencing the motivation, but we are not determining the motivation. We can acknowledge the complexity in motivational climates means that coaches and practitioners must move away from a clear set of golden rules, right? So again, you can have rules and behaviors to help guide, but you also need to be willing to adapt to certain circumstances and changes as well, because to be frank, things are not that simple. Almost every strategy or behavior that we might recommend as practitioners could easily be nullified by a change of circumstances, right? So again, you could say, okay, here's your goal, here's what you want to accomplish. Okay, well, boom, athlete gets injured. Whatever that is now is completely irrelevant because now the situation has changed. So we need to be able to adapt, right? And adaptation is always key. Again, edge of chaos. You want to be in a state where you can adapt to the changes and circumstances in the context. Again, too stable, you're not going to go anywhere. And if you end up going to a chaotic state, well, you're not going to go anywhere there either. A good final takeaway, I think, is to learn how to identify certain dashboard indicators of motivation, such as attention, energy, effort, and enjoyment, so that when you're making these observations with your athletes, these local level interactions, things like that, you could start to say, okay, if there's certain indicators that kind of go off, and you say, that's an indicator, that's a red flag. I should maybe try to get more information, or maybe focus a little more and learn from, or maybe if you need to make an intervention, things like that. That would be very important. So with that said, that's all I got. Appreciate you, and especially you, Steffi, because always good to have you here. And yeah, if you have any questions, let's talk.
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic, because sometimes we don't pay that more attention about that little details, because like you said, the system is really complex, and you have to see the motivation individual and by group, and then all that attention, energy, effort, enjoyment, the background. It's so important, because sometimes the background is gonna make them act, react, or behave certain with a certain way.
Yeah.
And when you make a team, or even in the individual sport, that they train together, it's like a team. And
Exactly.
I did write some things that for me was really important, and then I have a question that I think that the coach or the staff of the coach, the whole team staff, has to have like the same goal and go by the same way, because
Right.
if not, that will be different of the rules. It's not going to be structured. So that is not going to make the mentality of growth and learn when a chaos come.
Yeah,
Instead, it's gonna be like, okay, it's your fault. No, it is your fault. No, my fault. So that's the edge of a chaos. Is not gonna be the problem of losing or making a mistake. It's gonna be like the whole adaptive system.
exactly. And that's the thing too, is like, the system can have a goal, right? Where everybody has, okay, the support staff, they all have the same goal, right? But remember, every person on that support staff also has a different role, right? So the coach, the sports psychologist, maybe the assistant coaches, right? Like when I was on the soccer team, we had a goal coach, we had a coach that focused on developing the defense. I was the strength and conditioning coach and sports psychologist. So yeah, we all had the same goal as a team, but then it came down to like, okay, well, what is my role and what are my goals in that are specific to my role, right? So I'm saying, okay, how do my goals dictate, or how does the team's goal dictate what my goals are as a professional? And then how do I use that to determine, okay, what are my actions as a coach, right? So that's exactly right on point, I think.
Yeah, and I what I was gonna ask you is that sometimes in sport group sports like soccer or basketball and all of them, sometimes working with the youth, it's sometimes easy, sometimes it's better for us as a part of a sports psychologist, because when they are younger, it's like you can do a lot of activities and you can do everything with them, and they are like, okay, we have to learn sometimes. But when you go to the top group, like the higher one, that are they are professional, they win a lot of money, they already have family, or they have another business, or they are like in another elite part. But it's more complex to work with them, because there are some activities that you try to make, because this is gonna be like, my goal is to work communication, or to work with the climate of the team, and they
Mhm.
are like, oh, that's child, or
Yeah,
no, that wasn't fun, and it's,
yeah.
no, we're not working fun here. But
And that's
it's more
also,
complex.
yeah, and that's also kind of hard too, because when you get to those higher levels, they're more set in, like, they have their own like stability, right? And they're more set in that stability. So they're they're more resistant to that kind of change and adaptation, because they're saying, well, this is what I've always done to get, and this is where I'm at right now, and this is what works. So this is exactly where I'm at. So that's kind of the hard part, is to say, okay, well, yeah, this does feel childish, and maybe, something that you don't fully appreciate, but it's trying to convince them, here's why this is still important. I had the same issue with that soccer team. It's like, we're trying to play some games that were like, games that, yeah, you would probably expect, elementary school kids to play. And I'm like, I'm trying to tell the team and saying, hey, no, these are also, they're fun and they're really important, because, here's the reasons why we're doing this. And I think one thing that really helps with that is to like be clear and saying, okay, yeah, this feels childish, and that's the point, because here's the goals, the outcome goals that we want to get out of this, right? So, and I think sometimes with that level of communication, I think that really can help them sometimes, because if they are more willing to grow and adapt, then they're more open to those kind of exercises, I think.
Yeah, but that was part of my question, that it's complicated with them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the part too, is like, you and sometimes, you remind the athletes, and I remind my athletes of this all the time, because you get athletes that are like, yeah, I'm the best, I'm so great, I'm so special, I don't need to do anything different, I'm doing just fine, and they kind of have this like, ego oriented mindset, as it were.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, the best athletes are the ones who are constantly striving to improve. They are the ones who are constantly asking, how can I get better? How can I grow? What can I do different? Right. Those are the athletes where it's like their motivation is more intrinsic by start. They're saying, well, even within their own perceptions of themselves, they think, I can do better. And so they're constantly saying, go into their coaches and go into their professionals and saying, what can I do better? And to the point where they sometimes will actually get frustrated when you sit there and you're like, I don't know how to help you because you're so damn good. I don't know how to help you get better, but because they get frustrated because they're like, I want to get better, and so with sometimes with these athletes that are more ego oriented, you kind of have to use that as an example and say, hey, every athlete always has something to improve upon in some way, and those athletes who are the most successful are going to be the ones that are constantly trying to improve themselves. And sometimes you can get that message through to say, hey, because if you say, well, the reason why certain athletes like Michael Phelps get to the Olympics and get to the top, get to where they are, is because of this, and sometimes, being able to put that kind of message helps them to understand, yeah, you're good, but you can always be better. Everybody can always be better.
That's true.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what is like in your experiences, like, how have you worked with like athletes in the past with that kind of like attitude?
I think that I have been working a lot. Well, the two or three times that I have worked with a team, I work it with like the how to say when it's I use some of the coaches. So I work with a coach and we try like to, okay, you talk this, I'm gonna talk this, and I'm gonna start by this point. So we do like a little team that is gonna work trying to change the attitude of the player. But sometimes it's really hard, and sometimes even the when the whole team is like you're the only one that is left out, they started to talk with them. But I have never it's been quite different, because the first time I worked with a team, it was that like the elite part, the top of them, and it was really hard because the one that was with that attitude, that coaches already like analyzing, and he was like, okay, you're not gonna go to this tournament if you keep doing this. So I had that backup. And the second time, they were 15 and 16, so it was a lot easier. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was the whole different thing. Yeah.
Well, and here's maybe something like kind of go back to our to the presentation I did, right? Is the self similarity, right? Say, okay, well, maybe initially you're like, okay, well, here's the overall condition, the climate of this team, right? So here's the motivational climate, here's the condition, right? Well, maybe it's not a top down approach, maybe it's a bottom up approach, and you say, okay, instead of trying to enact a greater change, in the beginning, as you focus on those momentary interactions, those situational behaviors, right? So, from there, then you could say, it's the butterflies. You start to, put some butterflies into the team, and you say, okay, well, as you have this interaction, say, intervene in that little interaction. Oh yeah, is that, well, it's interesting that why do you have that kind of attitude, or why did you do this, and you can, just use those kind of like moments to say, okay, well, why did you take this shot and rather than pass it, or something like that, and start to make them think and say, okay, well, be able to use that to start to put those butterflies in there, so that maybe when they interact with each other, then they can help enact a greater change within the system itself, because that's kind of the advantage of this, right? Is that sometimes these interventions don't need to be these big, huge, large scale interventions. It could just be like, let's just have a conversation really quick and just talk about this, and that could, in the end,
and sometimes us as a psychologist, we started to do that complex thing. I know we have to go basic, I think, sometimes in that cases. Yeah, that's true.
Exactly, and so that's like, yeah, kind of the advantage of that there is to say, okay, well, and sometimes it takes longer, right? Because sometimes, like, you could have like a small intervention like that, like a quick interaction, and it goes nowhere. So then you have to maybe try again in a different circumstance, or maybe you have to have a couple of them within the practice before you really start to like, or a few practices where you have to kind of remind before it really starts to take shape. So it's just one of those things that you gotta be persistent to it. You got to be resilient to it, and just keep practicing and keep like going at it until you start to see an observable change in the behavior. Yeah.
And I think that we as a sports psychologist have to be like really consistent and never give up, even if the case is really hard, but like never give up and try and try and try and like have that discipline to I don't know, to just grow with them.
Exactly. And I mean, one of the things, like, and when I was working with the soccer team, I really enjoyed this, was that I was on the pitch with them during the entire practice. Obviously, as the strength and conditioning coach, I was there for the coaching of my practice, my portion of the practice. But outside of when we were done with that, I was sitting there observing with the other coaches. I wasn't telling them, I wasn't running the drills. I wasn't really doing anything in terms of like the actual soccer practice itself, because I don't know shit about soccer, so I'm not going to set up the drills. But I was sitting there the whole time observing them and saying, okay, like taking this high resolution, observations, asking quick, how are you feeling? How's it going? How's it going? Blah, blah, blah. Stuff like this. Well, the players started to, get more used to my presence. And sometimes they would, after a while, they used to get to a point where, they make eye contact with me and they tell me how they're doing. And I don't even ask them, right? They're like, oh, this was a good practice today. I'm like, okay, well, I didn't ask you, but great to know, and stuff like that. So, and I was able to develop stronger relationships with the team, the individual athletes, but the team as a whole. So then, I mean, they were more likely to like be themselves with my presence. But the more that I was able to observe them, the more information I was able to get out of their behaviors and their interactions with each other during the team, that made it a lot easier for me to be able to understand, okay, like what athletes respond in different ways and how can I interact with certain athletes, or, stuff like that. And that just made a lot easier for me as well to come in and make sometimes interventions and say, hey, I observed a different behavior from you than what I'm used to seeing. What's going on? Is there something wrong? Are you doing okay? And be able to, step in if I need to, and be able to do it a lot quicker, because then in this case, it was the relationship with me as a sports psychologist, but also I was a little bit more in tune with what was going on with every individual in that moment, along with the team. So, constantly being active and interactive on that field with them the whole time. And the head coach knew that. So if I took a player out of the practice and I said, hey, this player's coming with me right now, coach didn't question it. Coach didn't ask any questions, didn't ask what I was doing, because he knew that whatever I was doing was, more important than whatever that specific drill was in that moment, And so from there,
but also when to take him out. It's not gonna, you were not gonna take him out just to talk. You were gonna take him out to talk important thing. So that's like that's the way you're gonna like win the confidence of the coach, and he will let you do that. Yeah,
exactly. And it also helped
important the boundaries that we work, and the communication with the coach, and like being on the field at least one or two training session is gonna be way better than not going than not being in the training session.
Exactly. Like I get sometimes surprised when I'm like, I see some sports psychologists that never attend the practices. And I'm like, so what, you just have an office and you just wait for these athletes to come and like make an appointment? Like, or maybe you host a workshop once in a while to say, here's how you, do slow paced breathing or whatever. Like that's, I don't know. I mean, I look at it because I coming from a coaching background, right? So my background is like, and I'm like, I see myself as a sports psychologist also coaching, which is why I'm like, I like doing strength and conditioning coaching and sports psychology at the same time, because it's like, well, I'm coaching the athletes, but also it gives me a reason I'm there in the practices and stuff like that, because, in the end, it's like, it's like you said, building confidence in a relationship with the other coaches, but it's also saying, hey, I'm not just here as a sports psychologist, I'm here as a mental coach, and it's also like shaping the attitude of the athletes. Okay, I'm not working with you because there's something wrong with you. You don't have to deal with it, work with a sports psychologist because you're, facing depression or something like that. No, I'm here to help you perform at your best. They're training you on the technical and the tactical stuff. I'm training you on the mental and the physical stuff, So we're all working together to help you be as a successful athlete as you can.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, well, cool. Well, do you have any other questions or anything?
Well, no, I think it was a really good presentation, I enjoyed this part of talking about it and like making some reflection about that thing, that the topic.
Yeah, me too. And I'm very excited because yeah, this is like I said, so we're doing this as we wrote this as a textbook chapter actually. That's coming out in the fall.
Oh,
And I'm
that's
really excited about
great.
it. Yeah, and I'm really excited about it. And I'll post the paper for because I co-wrote this with. Do you remember Richard Keegan?
No?
Okay, so he's a researcher in Australia who does a lot of work on motivational climate, and so like a lot of what we know on motivational climate is all his work.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
great.
so yeah, so like in a lot of the papers that we used for the basis of that. So I co-wrote the textbook chapter with him. So he did the sections on motivational climate. I did the sections on complex systems because I didn't have to. I wasn't even required during my master program, but I was like, complex systems is so cool. I need to learn all about this, and so I did so much self study on it, and then ultimately, I was invited to help him co-write this textbook chapter. But this is the
That
first
was a
time
great
that any.
opportunity.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was really cool, and it was like because like right like there's no because there's no prior like there's no papers, there's no anything on this kind of topic and using complex systems like there's a limited there's complex systems in psychology and stuff, but it also examines like a lot of it examines a lot of things, but there's hardly anything on sports psychology, and there's definitely nothing on motivation and stuff like that. So it's like really neat to be able to like look at this through that lens and saying, okay, how can we better understand, these things like motivational climate and stuff like that? Because even during like my master program, I was like learning about this stuff, and with the reductionist science, I was like, I'd ask questions like, well, why are we, following this theory if it's got so many flaws, and they like couldn't really answer that, and I'm like, well, like, are we supposed to accept this entirely as like, so it felt very limited in a lot of ways. So then when I actually started reading about this stuff, I was like, this is actually, I think, a lot
It's
easier.
really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
that's great.
yeah.
Congratulations, Dirk. You
Oh,
have to
thank you.
send that to me. Well,
Yeah,
or send me the link to buy it.
exactly. Yeah, I'll send you a copy of the textbook or the link when I get it. But yeah, so here's some of the textbooks that I've been reading to learn about this kind of stuff. So like these huge, like super thick
Yeah.
books.
With a little letter that is just